Hello and welcome to Terra Verde, a weekly environmental public affairs program co-hosted by Earth Island Journal and KPFA. My name's Hannah Wilton and I'm the host of today's show. Many of us here in California rely on water that comes from the Colorado River Basin, a system that provides water for over 40 million people across the western US and northern Mexico. But as many of us know and are watching in the news, the river is running critically low after decades of drought, record heat, and overuse. Even as water becomes scarcer, a new report finds that some water districts pay little to nothing for water supplies. Major agricultural users often pay just a fraction, sometimes zero, of what cities pay for the same water. Researchers say these prices weaken incentives to conserve and have pushed the Colorado system to its lowest storage levels in decades. I'm joined by two of the authors of that report titled Free Water While It Lasts, an analysis of wholesale water pricing in the Colorado River Basin states. I'm joined by Isabel Friedman, Senior Advocacy Associate for the Natural Resources Defense Council's Environmental Health Program. Her work focuses on how climate change and emerging technologies impact communities and people on the ground. I'm also here with Noah Garrison, Environmental Science Practicum Director at the UCLA Institute of the Environment and Sustainability, where he oversees the capstone program in environmental science and researches water supply, use, and sustainability in the Colorado River Basin and Western US. Hi, you both. Thanks so much for joining me on the call today.
Thanks for having
Thanks for
us.
having us.
So, Noah, your research highlights that the challenges in the Colorado River Basin aren't just about drought or climate change. They're also the result of decisions, many decisions made over the past century about who gets water and how it's priced. I'd love to start us off with just getting a sense of how this history has shaped the system we see today and how it's contributed to some of the challenges that we're facing now.
Well, Hannah, as you mentioned earlier, the Colorado River is a critical resource for 40 million people across seven western states. But the way we divided that river up and the way we allocate water from it dates back, in many cases, more than a century. And in particular, there was what's called the Law of the River, which is a set of agreements and contracts and treaties that govern how we divide up the river. The largest based on in 1922 called the Colorado River Compact, which effectively divided up the river half between what's known as the upper basin states, which are Wyoming, Utah, Colorado, and New Mexico, and half to the lower basin states of Arizona, Nevada, and California, with an additional amount left over for Mexico. The problem is that when we divided the river up at that time, we based the volume or the amount of water that was going to be available on one of the wettest decades on record. We based it on an abnormally wet period. So we effectively decided there was going to be more water available in the river than there actually is. The average flow in the Colorado River over the last century is something on the order of about 1 million acre feet, enough water for 4 to 8 million people, less than actually flows through the river. And that flow, as you indicated, as a result of climate change and drought and other impacts, has decreased over time to the point that now we're facing a shortfall of something between 2 and 4 million acre feet per year, or roughly a quarter of the amount that we promised. And effectively, the water that we've promised just doesn't exist.
I would add to that and say since 1922, when this first Colorado River Compact was put together, there have been numerous of updates to this original contract, but the foundational system that prices this water has really remained largely unchanged. And today, just as it was 100 years ago when this document was first put together, substantial volumes of water from the Colorado River Basin are being sold and diverted at little to no cost. And I think this background is really important as we get into the results of our study, just to understand where we are and how, in a lot of ways, our society has radically changed in the last century, but the way that we treat water has really stagnated and has not been modernized to meet our current demands.
Thanks for offering that context. Yeah, Isabel, can you just continue to dig into the report? that you co-authored. How is water actually priced and distributed today? Can you explain some of the major disparities you found between agricultural districts and cities, and then kind of why those pricing differences matter for conservation and long-term water sustainability in the Colorado River Basin?
Yeah, absolutely. And I can start with just a high level number to ground this discussion that our report found that more than 7 million acre feet of water are obtained for less than $1 per acre foot from the government each year. And just to give context, the high end of water pricing that we found in our report is over $1,000, closer to the $2,000 to $3,000 range. So diverting water at less than $1 per acre foot is drastically lower than that. And for context of the 7 million acre feet, that's about the amount of water consumed by 21 million households annually. And of this subsect of free water, more than half of that is received by just 5 agricultural districts for $0 an acre foot. And these districts are all located in California, and they include the Coachella Valley Water District, Imperial Irrigation District, the Palo Verde Irrigation District, Truckee Carson, and then one other referred to as Unit B. And this really cheap water comes into sharp contrast of the almost 2 million acre feet of water that are purchased by primarily municipal districts for more than $1,000 an acre foot. And all of this relatively higher priced water is located in California. And I would just say, to give context of just like the disparity between these municipal and agricultural districts, in areas that don't benefit from these historic federal contracts with very inexpensive water, people living there kind of end up paying 3 times over. They pay both for their own water, they pay again through taxes that subsidize other regions. And then also, I mean, we're all paying with these mounting costs of water shortages that are materializing across the West and that are only intensifying year over year.
And I think one
Noah,
one thing I would add, I was going to say one thing I would add to that is that, pointing to this low cost water, we're basing pricing systems on contracts and agreements and really policies that we put in place over a century ago that simply do not reflect modern conditions. They don't reflect the current reality that we are facing water shortfalls, that we do have, that this is not a limitless resource that we can just give away for free. And we treat it as if it is limitless. And that has enormous impacts on, the long-term viability of the Colorado River and other river and mountain systems to supply our water.
Yeah, and I think one more thing to add, which Noah was just touching on, but you asked this question of like, why is it a problem that water is priced where it doesn't reflect the value of the resource? And I think what we've found, and this is both in wholesale and retail water suppliers, is like low water prices really don't reflect the scarcity, and then ultimately, importantly, disincentivize sustainable practices and conservation efforts. And, especially in cities, we see so many different efforts to reduce the amount of water that we are using as individuals. And, we have reusable water bottles. We have ways to not, to grow less water intensive plants on our front lawns. And
Low flow
I think
toilets and shower heads and
exactly, all
yeah.
of those. And but without pricing, that incentive really isn't there on a larger scale. And therefore the decisions that we're making, both from like the corporate level in the agricultural world, and then also at a state level with water management, just isn't reflective of where we actually are. And one more thing I just want to make sure that we touch on that we found out in this study, which was really surprising to me, is the federal government not only gives away this essentially free water to certain districts, but they end up buying water back from these districts for conservation purposes. And this ends up being priced at more than $400 an acre foot. So they're giving water away for free, and they're purchasing this water back for $400 an acre foot at an enormous cost to taxpayers. So that's when we talk about taxpayers subsidizing these wholesale water districts. That's where we're talking about that money coming from.
So the report also discusses a number of proposals to address this kind of growing crisis. And one of the recommendations discussed is a water reliability and security surcharge. So adjusting the price of water, the cost of water on federally supplied water, and essentially putting a price on water that has historically been free or nearly free, as you have both been discussing. So Noah, can you explain how this surcharge would work and also what it's intended to achieve? And then Isabel, I would really be curious to hear from you how you might address the concern that a surcharge could lead to higher costs for consumers or for agricultural producers who are already operating on very thin margins.
Absolutely. So currently in the system, when the federal government supplies water through one of its major infrastructure projects, the two largest would be Lake Powell behind Glen Canyon Dam and Lake Mead behind Hoover Dam on the Colorado River system. That water, the actual water itself, is supplied for free. Different districts or entities that are receiving the water may pay possibly for the cost of conveyance and potentially for the infrastructure that's conveying the water, but the water itself is given away for free. And we're proposing that given the incredible shortfalls we're facing and the increasing costs that imposes on society for reliability, for safety, for replacing old and outdated infrastructure, that we place a $50 surcharge on every acre foot of water sold by the federal government, whether it's to an agricultural entity or a municipal one. And that water could be used in the districts that are paying that fee for improving infrastructure, for improving irrigation practices, or replacing conveyance systems that are wearing out, for addressing other impacts of water use. In California's Central Valley, for example, we have major problems with ground subsidence as a result of groundwater use. That water is taken out of the ground surface then collapses or lowers, and that can wreak havoc on infrastructure and impose hundreds of $millions in costs. And using that surcharge to help improve water supply reliability and efficiency and conservation.
On the point of then how do we deal with potentially or how do we address the question of like whether this will raise prices to consumers and then also for farmers who are potentially already struggling to reach profits. I think I just want to acknowledge like this affordability crisis is real for everyone, and there's a reason why this is almost, it feels like the buzzword of the last year or two, because it like people are really being squeezed from all angles. And this is true for people who live in cities, it's true for farmers, and it's true for everyone in both rural and urban America. And I just want to highlight that in a lot of ways, us taxpayers are already paying for this. We've been subsidizing agricultural districts and wholesalers for decades. And the goal of our surcharge recommendation really isn't to target small farmers and small districts. And we set a minimum amount of water diverted at roughly 10,000 acre feet, who would then be eligible to receive this surcharge or to, pay the surcharge. And the goal of that is really to target these huge water users and water wholesalers rather than looking at like the smaller fish in the pond. And I would just stress that right now we're subsidizing water in a way that just ensures that it'll continue to be wasted rather than conserved. And the point of this is really to create a new way of looking at water and pricing water that protects us moving forward.
And I think a critical point that Isabel made there is that this is number one, it's really aimed at much larger scale water users that divert a substantial quantity of water per year. 10,000 acre feet per year is enough for 20,000 families for their full water supply over the entire course of a year. So we're really looking at larger scale water users. But we're also looking, this surcharge would apply equally to municipal users who already pay a significantly higher price for their water, as well as for agricultural districts that may pay nothing. And with a goal of really increasing and improving reliability in these systems as we face, increasing challenges from climate change, drought, and other pressures.
If you're just tuning in, you're listening to Terra Verde on KPFA. My name's Hannah Wilton, and today I'm speaking with Isabel Friedman from the NRDC and Noah Garrison from UCLA about their new report, Free water while it lasts, an analysis of wholesale water pricing in the lower Colorado River Basin states. So thank you so much for the context that you've both offered about the report. The current operating agreements for the Colorado River expired at the end of 2025. And the seven basin states are still very much deadlocked on how to allocate water amidst this kind of historic drought and shrinking reservoirs. Noah, could you speak to kind of the broader landscape? What's going on in this moment around these negotiations? And curious to know how insights from your report might offer some guidance for policymakers and water managers that are navigating this very complex landscape.
It is a complex and messy landscape. I think, as we indicated earlier, for a variety of reasons, including drought and climate change, the actual flow, the actual amount of water that is in the Colorado River is substantially less than the water we have promised everyone. And there's a shortfall of something on the order of 2 to 4 million acre feet per year, which is roughly a quarter of the amount of water that we have promised to everybody. And we're in a situation right now where the states really need to come to an agreement over how they are going to make cuts in order to address that shortfall. Unfortunately, we don't appear to be close to an agreement. There are vast differences in approach and amounts that need to be reduced that are being proposed by the states, to the point that at some point the federal government would have to step in and just sort of dictate how those cuts are going to be made. So far, the government has not shown any inclination to actually do that, but it seems like some form of cuts are looming here. The one of the biggest problems in terms of the policy and making these decisions, as outlined in our report, is that among all the other information that's being considered, price does not appear to be part of that conversation, and so we are still treating this water, even though it's clear that we have a shortfall, we're treating it as though it's limitless and we can give it away. And including a price signal there, where to date, price isn't considered in how are we going to allocate this water? How are we going to make decisions about potentially crops that should be grown or more efficient ways to irrigate or how cities are going to use their water? The fact that that's not currently considered is kind of crazy. And so our report, we hope, sheds a light on that and allows policymakers to make more informed decisions in this process based on including price as a really critical point to be considered.
I would just add two levels of detail to that. So in January, the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation released a draft environmental impact statement, and this had 5 different alternatives for possibilities to manage the basin after 2026, all of which required, all other than one, required large cuts from the lower basin. And the 5 options were ranging from taking no action to, on the higher side, having a supply-driven system. But one thing I'd stress is none of these 5 plans talked about pricing reform at all. And I think this is where we see absolutely through this process with the federal government, we need to incorporate pricing reform and the discussion of how costs play into our management of these water systems. And also we kind of just need to lean on what to me seems like one of our most basic conservation tools that we have. Like pricing and looking at the way that we buy and sell things is one of the easiest and most simple ways to understand reducing the demand and having that and having it match up with our current, the science that we have that dictates how much we actually have. And the way that I see it is we just really can't afford to leave any conservation tool off the table at this point in the conversation.
Many of our listeners are located here in the Bay Area, but also just California more generally. And I'd love to hear a little bit more just about how California is kind of uniquely positioned or situated within this conversation, and specifically within the report as kind of one of the main agricultural producers for the United States and also just the world in general. Is there anything that either of you would add to that?
Absolutely. I think one of the first things is that California's water supply system, even aside from including the Colorado River, is enormously complex. And so, for example, for agriculture that you mentioned, a huge amount of California's water supply for agricultural systems in the San Joaquin and Central Valleys comes from the Sierra Nevada mountains. It doesn't actually come from the Colorado River, but that also is a federal project. There's a whole system called there's a whole system of dams and canals and aqueducts in California that supply water that comes from snowmelt or runoff coming off the Sierra Nevada mountains, captured in dams and delivered through the Central Valley or the Central Valley Project. That is also run by the federal government. And that system supplies water to agriculture at, I think, an average price of about $30 an acre foot. There's a slightly higher price, but still well below what the actual value of that water might be. And the goal when that system began construction in the 1930s was that over time it would be paid back by the users. They would pay for the infrastructure, they would pay for the cost of running this system and maintaining it. But to date, we've come absolutely nowhere near paying back that system. We're not on path to pay back that system. Effectively it's been a burden placed on taxpayers to fund this, while agricultural users and in some cases municipalities get the water relatively free of charge or at incredibly low cost. And so you have a similar problem where the price of water that is actually received does not in any way reflect the actual cost of providing it, let alone the value of the resource.
And I would just add to that, when we talk about California in relation to other lower basin states of Nevada and Arizona, we found in this research that districts in California pay significantly more than the other two states on average by multiples of
Or
2.4.
municipalities do.
Yes.
Yes, right. Yeah.
Yes, by multiples of 2.5 times that of Nevada and almost 7 times the prices of Arizona. And this, in a lot of cases, does reflect higher costs of conveyance and delivery. But in a lot of instances, in a lot of instances, also ultimately end up we see municipalities having over $2,000 an acre foot price set for water. And then the same agricultural wholesalers are still being charged $0 an acre foot on average. Yeah.
And this can reflect in many cases that the transactions and the conveyance agreements that occur are enormously complex, but bake in profits for people who are selling and reselling water. So, for example, the Imperial Irrigation District receives water effectively for free from the federal government through the Colorado River, but can then sell that water to San Diego through a series of transactions at a price of something on the order of $1,600 an acre foot. Some of that reflects conveyance costs and the cost of treating and sort of moving that water around. Some of it is just profit that is then received by the irrigation districts. And so in many cases, cities are paying not just for the cost of the conveyance, but also for the cost of resales where profits are baked in.
So, as you guys did research for this report, I'm really curious to know what about this whole system, the infrastructure governance, surprised you the most? And what's one thing that you think every Californian should understand about where their water comes from, or how it connects to the food that they eat? Perhaps Isabel, we can hear from you first, and then Noah.
Sure, absolutely. Um, I think what surprised me the most is just the general lack of transparency around a lot of these water contracts. And we learned through this that there is currently no comprehensive public database that tracks water inventories by wholesalers. And this makes it really difficult to make accurate decisions over the future of our water management. And even as consumers to understand just what is going on in the water systems in our state. And I think part of this is only becoming more and more important as we see more large water users entering the state. Data centers are a huge talking point right now, and they're like large volumes of water consumption are obviously something that we're thinking about. And without transparency for both the wholesalers and also the companies that are using these large amounts of water, it's really hard for us to plan for the future. And I think this is one of the recommendations that we have, where just the importance of passing policy on water transparency and disclosure is really essential for holding these companies accountable.
And I would say that, having practiced in water arenas for, 20 years now, anecdotally, everyone sort of already, everyone sort of knows that in many cases, agriculture pays less for water than municipalities do. But really diving in and seeing these contracts from the 1930s that state that water will be delivered by the federal government at no charge or at 25 cents per acre foot, and that's still the metric we're using, is a little bit shocking, given how much, in the news and in everyday life we're facing pressure on water resources. So that was quite a shock to see. I do want to echo Isabel's point on sort of this data. There's no transparency. There's nowhere you can just find this data. It took us more than a year to gather all the data on pricing and then cross-check it against all the myriad transactions that are occurring between water districts. And that was looking only at the lower Colorado River Basin. We didn't even begin investigating the upper basin and looking really only at surface water resources. We didn't get into groundwater. We didn't get into people who had their own individual water rights that just drew water out of the river. So we're looking really at sort of wholesale transactions. And even that took us more than a year to gather. And so for the public, or in many cases for even policymakers, understanding a true picture of what we're paying for water is almost hopeless.
I'd love, as we kind of come to the end of the show here, just to know, where can people go to find out more about your research, to find and read the report? How would you suggest that folks engage in this really important topic?
Yeah, well, thanks so much, Hannah. And you can find me online through my NRDC profile. My name's Isabel Friedman again. And please feel free to reach out to me. My email is my first initial I and then friedman@nrdc.org. And you will see any updates on NRDC's work on water scarcity there. And I guess, Noah, please go ahead on your end.
I have less of an online presence in that sense, but I think that people can get a lot of information about this ongoing process. Even just at a newspaper or public radio or podcast level, that this is becoming a larger and larger story. As you said at the start of this broadcast, this is the water source for 40 million people. And we have to come to a resolution about this. We have to find a solution for how we are going to equitably supply that water and ensure that our most pressing needs are met and that people have a reliable supply of water in the Western United States. And so I think, certainly just learning about this issue through the news or through reports like ours, you can find this on both UCLA and NRDC's websites. But also, there are constant updates being provided by the federal government in this process and by the states, and sort of taking time to learn about that and potentially write to your elected officials or to the people driving these policies and letting them know that this is important to you and you care about it is a critical way to engage.
And I would just add to that also just being informed about like what your local water utility is doing with their water practices is like one of the most hyper local things that we can do, because it directly impacts the way that we pay for water and the way that the people who sell us water pay for water. So just being informed on what is going on in your like very small niche in our bigger water system is so important.
So we'll go ahead and close the show. Thanks so much to everyone who tuned in to listen, especially all the supporters of KPFA who make our independent broadcast efforts possible. Your support keeps us on the air, so please consider making a donation to KPFA. You'll find this episode of Terra Verde and other shows in the online archive on kpfa.org or on the Earth Island Journal's podcast page.
That car in your driveway isn't doing much these days, but it could still take a stand. At KPFA, we turn old cars, trucks, and boats into fuel for independent journalism, music, and ideas that move people. It's simple. Dig up your title and VIN number. Call 877-411-3662 or visit kpfa.org and click Donate Your Car. We'll pick it up, handle the details, and send you a tax receipt when it sells. You clear some space. We keep free speech on the air. So before you let that engine rust, let it do one last beautiful thing. Donate your vehicle to KPFA and turn something parked into something powerful.
94.1 KPFA and 89.3 KPFB in Berkeley, 88.1 KFCF in Fresno, and online at kpfa.org.